Good morning, everybody. In the interest of time and respecting your time, I want us to get started today. We've got a lot of content to deliver to you, and more importantly, we want to have a lot of time for questions and answers for you, because this is a complicated topic, and we want to make sure that we can address questions, concerns, and all of that kind of stuff. I'm Steve Nash. I'm Director of Anthropology here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I'm joined today by Chris Petrello, our new-ish Curator of Anthropology. Been here less than a year, almost a year, next 2 months? Almost a year. And then Chance Ward, one of our Indigenous Science interns, and they're going to join me in presenting an overview and status update on NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, as it pertains to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We had hoped that Dominique Alhambra was going to be able to join us. She is who was recently our collections manager in anthropology. She's taken a job at the Burke Museum in Seattle, University of Washington, which is fantastic, so she can't be here today. I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you a background history of NAGPRA here at the museum, as well as an overview of what the law is and is not. And then I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about some of the NAGPRA projects that we're working on right now. And then Chance is going to reflect on NAGPRA from his experience as an Indigenous person, as a museum professional, as an archaeologist, etc. So we're going to wrap this up, the formal presentation, by 10:30 sharp, although they've taken away the doomsday clock that used to be up here. So if I go on too long, start making doomsday noises, and I'll be quiet. All right, NAGPRA, I'll get to NAGPRA in a second. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science Anthropology Department, Archaeology Department has a unique history that is germane to this discussion. And it's germane for a bunch of different reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that our Anthropology Archaeology Department really started long after the days of truly, truly egregious collecting activities happened. The heyday of that, if you want to call it that, really occurred from about 1840 up till 1920, 1930. We didn't have a Department of Anthropology. We didn't have an archaeologist on staff at this museum until 1935, when we hired Hannah Marie Wormington, who was a bachelor's degree holding archaeologist from the University of Denver, a recent graduate of East High School and the University of Denver, hired to work on collections. She became curator of archaeology for the next 3 decades. But her archaeology was not focused on sites in which human remains and sacred objects and funerary objects were present. She was working on stuff that was much older than that. It's not to say that those aren't sacred sites and important sites, but as a general practice, the sites that she was excavating were lithic scatters, stone tool scatters, and they did not have huge amounts of people, frankly, to be blunt, in them. So her collecting activity didn't lead to a lot of archaeological materials coming in that are really, really important, that are really, really critical when it comes to NAGPRA. Then in 1968, we got the Mary and Frances Crane collection. It's too detailed a thing to go into right now, but it was an ethnographic collection that had been a museum in Florida. We got it the same year that Wormington left the museum. There's some archaeology in that collection. There's also ethnographic materials, and as Chris so dutifully pointed out, that collection is really an art collection masquerading as an ethnographic collection. The point here is that we never had PhD archaeologists and anthropologists going out and systematically collecting the kinds of, in the ways that, say, the Field Museum, the Smithsonian, the American Museum, and other places had, in which thousands upon thousands of ancestors and sacred objects and funerary objects were coming back to the institution. That just wasn't our history. That's not to say that we don't have work to do and haven't done a lot of work. It is to say that our history is unique. The law is passed in 1990, and I'll go over this in just a second. And then what I'll argue is that the modern era begins in about 2006. And there's a whole bunch of people named here. I'm not going to go through this, but there's a whole bunch of people, dozens upon dozens of people at this institution who have helped us achieve what we've done with NAGPRA. But really, the modern era starts in about 2006. So in 2008, Chip Caldwell and I and Isabel Tovar, the collections manager, Chip was the previous curator, submitted to senior leadership and the trustees new repatriation policies. And in that, we argued, and the institution accepted, and the trustees accepted, that repatriation is a human rights issue. It's not property law. It's not an issue of whether or not the museum has legal title to these things. It is a human rights issue. And the principles that we use to inform this policy include justice, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. That's written in the policy that was accepted by the trustees in 2008. And justice is in there. Now, I know that there's instances where people say this isn't really justice. We're not trying to do everything. But we did want to inform our decision-making with respect to the ancestors and the sacred objects and things in the collection with respect to doing justice, because we know that museums have caused harm to various communities. We also, in 2008, made a conscious decision, a deliberate decision, that we were no longer going to curate human remains in the absence of informed consent. Sign on the dotted line, and we might talk about curating your remains. We do it in the Genetics of Taste laboratory. We do it elsewhere, but we weren't going. But that's all with permission. We decided we weren't going to curate human remains in the absence of informed consent. So what is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act? Signed into law, George Bush, the first, George Herbert Walker Bush, signed it into law. John McCain was actually one of the sponsors of it. November 16th, 1990. What is NAGPRA? It is, hold your breath, the legal process by which lineal descendants, that means identified descendants of certain individuals, and federally recognized tribes can make formal claims to museums and repositories for the return of human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. 4 categories. I'll come back to those here in a little bit. The axial concept of NAGPRA is cultural affiliation. That means that in order to make a claim, you either have to be, lineal descendant can just say, that's my grandfather, my grandmother, and if they can prove it, that's one thing. But for a federally recognized tribe to have a successful claim, they have to demonstrate that they have some cultural affiliation with the collections and ancestors that are represented there. This is a really murky topic, and in the law, it says that you have to evaluate 10 lines of evidence. You, I mean the institution, have to evaluate 10 lines of evidence in order to make a cultural affiliation determination. Those lines of evidence include archaeological, biographical, geographical, biological, geographical, and anthropological lines of evidence. It also includes folklore, history, kinship data, linguistic data, oral tradition, and other expert opinion. The reason that I separated these two into 2 bullet points is because for many years, many institutions and scientists, people like me, have hidden behind these 4 lines of evidence while not taking into account those 6, especially other expert opinion. One way that you can read other expert opinion is elders, religious practitioners, and others. So institutions have long hidden behind these because that's what they're familiar with, and then not acknowledged those. And so what is NAGPRA? It's a combination. It's a mussy, fussy combination of federal law, Indian law, property law, and human rights law. But as my friend DJ Jackson of the University of Wyoming Law School said, NAGPRA is what you get when you ask lawyers to solve a problem. He's right, folks. It is a complicated thing that doesn't make sense a lot of times. So how does it work? First of all, NAGPRA only affects public institutions or institutions that receive federal funding. So a private museum that gets an IMLS grant or something like that is then subject to NAGPRA. But there are big private collections out there with ancestors, with sacred objects, everything else that are not affected by NAGPRA because it's considered private property in this country. This only works in the United States. It only affects things in the United States, and Chris is going to allude to this fact in a few minutes. What happens is the museums are expected to publish inventories, and this was laws passed in 1990. The inventories were supposed to be published within 3 years and 5 years respectively, but museums didn't have any money to do this because NAGPRA is a partially funded mandate. But those inventories get published or don't. Over 3 decades, many institutions are not in compliance with this aspect. California State University system, 14 different universities or something like that, just announced that fewer than 10% of their institutions are compliant with NAGPRA right now, 3.5 decades after NAGPRA was passed. But the process is you publish the inventories, and then tribal nations see those inventories, and they make a formal written claim to the institution. And then one of the big problems with NAGPRA was that the institution, the museum and the repository, gets to make the determination on cultural affiliation. Today you look at that and say that's just conflict of interest, right? Museums are designed to collect and preserve, and then they're the ones who get to make the decision. That's an imbalance of power that NAGPRA, folks haven't rectified that yet, but we recognized that early on, and in fact, Chip Colwell published on this, and if you want his article on the problematic nature of that, I can get it for you. Once a written claim is submitted and evaluated and then cultural affiliation is sent, then you publish notices in the Federal Register. If you all have never checked out the Federal Register, go online, Google Federal Register and have a look. It is an unbelievably complicated, opaque, bizarre document, but that's the Federal Register. That is the record, the official record of what the federal government does. And so we have to publish those decisions in the Federal Register. Sometimes tribal nations will file counterclaims if they don't believe what we've done or if they don't believe the cultural affiliation, etc. In really, really unusual and bad circumstances, there is a standing NAGPRA review committee consisting of indigenous folk, museum folk, and others that will review decisions that are made and review conflicts, complaints, contentious issues. But their record has been spotty at best over the years. We've never done that. We've never had anything go up to the review committee. And then formal consultations between tribal nations and institutions can actually happen at any time during this process. Ideally, it happens long before you get to these phases, but it can happen at any time. Some museums restrict it only until after a claim has been filed. We try to do it a lot more frequently than that. There are some caveats to NAGPRA, and these are misconceptions about NAGPRA. NAGPRA does not mandate return of objects. It does not mandate return. Tribal nations can file a claim. The museum, the repository can address that claim, but it doesn't require things to be repatriated. The decision-making, as I mentioned, remains with the museums and the repositories. NAGPRA also does not mandate reburial. That is a discussion that can happen. Once ancestors or objects have been repatriated, it's up to the tribal nation to decide what they want to do. But NAGPRA doesn't mandate return and it doesn't mandate reburial. It provides a legal process by which institutions can address these issues. It's a partially funded mandate. Museums, tribal nations oftentimes don't have a lot of money to address this. So 3.5 decades after it was passed, we're still, museums are still in a bad way because nobody had any money to do it. We've also hidden behind that, not this institution, but others. There are unintended consequences. Remember DJ Jackson's quote there about it's what you get when you ask attorneys to solve a problem? I'm sure the tribal nations thought of this, but it didn't get incorporated into law. But sometimes the tribal nations have to come up with new ceremonies to rebury their ancestors because their ancestors have been removed from their journey. They were in that journey. They've been violently removed from that. They have to come up with new ceremonies, new cosmologies, if you will, to rebury those folks. I guarantee you there's not a museum person in the world who thought about that in 1990. Or if they did, they didn't go public with it. You also may have heard people say that NAGPRA and repatriation is a threat to science. It's patently not. It's required a reframing of science, absolutely, as well it should, but it's not a threat to science. All right, what's happened here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science? We believed when we passed those policy changes in 2008 that NAGPRA represents a floor. It constitutes a floor, not a ceiling. The ceiling is the morals and ethics that we want to be using to guide our research. The law is a floor. And this is one of the things that's been so disappointing for me with my discipline is that so many places have adhered to the floor and just done the bare minimum and dragged their feet through the bare minimum rather than taking a higher ground, a higher road. As far as sacred objects, we just decided to listen to the tribal nations and then do it. And as the Pope Benedict XIV, what is he now? Francis. Silly me, I'm sorry, Pope Francis. You may remember said a few years ago about people's sexuality, who am I to judge? Wow, that's a powerful statement. Well, when it comes to sacred objects, who are we to judge? But NAGPRA gives us, the museum, me, the curator, etc., people here, the power to make the decisions about what's a sacred object and not, based on those lines of evidence. That's wrong. That's wrong. So what we do is we listen to the tribal nations, and if they tell us an object is sacred, then let's have that discussion. But I'm not going to challenge that assertion. So what we've done today, remember that unique history that I talked about where DMNS was and is and ended up and all that. We've repatriated all 96 Native American ancestors from our collections that were here. They have all been reburied. There's 312 associated funerary objects. That means what people get buried with that have also been repatriated and reburied. Sacred objects, we did a big survey of our sacred objects. They've been sequestered downstairs or repatriated. And as we go through tribal consultations in the future, we're going to find additional sacred objects, and we will sequester them in a special place, and we'll have discussions about whether or not we should return them to the tribal nations. But again, we set out a long time ago to put the power in the cultural knowledge where it belonged as far as we were concerned. About 800 catalog numbers to date have been impacted by our work, and that's just our inventory control system. What I want to emphasize for you here is that this number is terribly small compared to some other institutions. And when Chip Colwell and I started this effort, I said, man, it's a good thing we're not trying to do this at the Field Museum where I used to work. And he said, why is that? And I said, because they've got 12,000 ancestors. And he said, that's a cop-out. And we were both right. Because the fact is, the unique history of this institution gave us some degrees of freedom to take action in a way that we weren't going to be bogged down in this huge problem. I do not want to apologize for other institutions that have had 3 decades to do this, but I will stand by the assertion that we were able to do things at this institution because the institution was ready for it, leadership was ready for it, and the problem was tractable, for lack of a better term. So, where do we stand in 2023? We are a recognized leader in NAGPRA and repatriations. We're a recognized leader in repatriation of human remains beyond NAGPRA. Keep in mind, NAGPRA only is germane. It's only relevant to Native American graves, hence the name. What if you've got other people's ancestors in the collections? Well, we did. Longer story for another time, but we repatriated, well, we didn't repatriate, we reburied those folks in Crestone, Colorado in a natural burial plot. We're also a leader in voluntary international returns, the Vigango that we repatriated to the coastal Kenya, Mijikenda 4 years ago. We're still recognized as a leader in that. So we've done some good things. It's not that we want to sit here and pat ourselves on the back, but chance favors the prepared, not that chance. Do you favor the prepared institution? Chance favors the prepared institution. Sorry, man. Chance favors the prepared institution. We were able to do some things here that many other museums couldn't or wouldn't. I don't want to apologize for them. They've got work to do. They can do it now. But we've paved a way for these folks to do some of these things and to stop hiding behind practice or protocol or legal things. My argument has always been, what's wrong with setting a precedent by doing the right thing? And we believed we were doing the right thing. So I'm going to turn it over. ProPublica article you may have seen in 2023 talking about repatriation in other museums. We came out clean in that as well we should, but then our work continues. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Thanks.
How's it going, everybody? I'm Chris Petrello. I'm the curator of anthropology. This is the first time in 15 years that I haven't presented with slides, so it's going to be an interesting experience. But I want to talk about some of the ongoing repatriation work that we're currently engaged in and illustrate a couple of key points. One, that NAGPRA is an ongoing process, that it is never done. Two, that we honor the spirit of the law and not the letter of the law. And three, that we have an obligation to be proactive rather than passive or reactive. So I'm going to talk about an ongoing claim we're working with right now with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, represented by the Onondaga Nation. So you may be more familiar with the term Iroquois or Iroquois Confederacy. So the Haudenosaunee occupy lands in what is today now New York and Canada, and a little bit in Oklahoma. And in 1995, the Grand Council of Haudenosaunee Chiefs issued a statement that saying all medicine faces and corn husk faces are sacred. Medicine faces are wooden masks used by medicine societies for individual and community healing. And corn husk faces have similar uses among Haudenosaunee medicine societies. They are not owned by individuals, but they are owned by the medicine societies to whom those medicine faces and corn husk faces belong. So in that statement, the Haudenosaunee Grand Council of Chiefs said that medicine faces in museum collections used formerly in medicine society performances Copies of Medicine Society faces and Cornhusk faces, as well as those that were made for sale, are all sacred the moment they are created. And therefore, museums that hold them, whether it is one used for healing ceremonies, a copy of one used for healing ceremonies, or one made for sale, must be repatriated. So in 1999, repatriation consultations with representatives of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, both in New York and in Oklahoma, began. So out of that initial 1999 repatriation consultation, the museum was able to repatriate some of the medicine faces, but not all of them. And then again, in 2018, the museum had repatriation consultations with representatives of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And one of the big challenges in both that 1999 and 2018 consultation was the fact that many of the medicine faces and cornhusk faces, most of which are copies or were made for sale, originate on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve in Canada, which means that they are not subject to NAGPRA, because NAGPRA only applies to federally recognized tribes in the United States and Native Hawaiian organizations. So it would have been very easy, as Steve had said, to hide behind the law and say, well, technically these are from Canada and aren't subject to NAGPRA, therefore we're not under no obligation to return them. And as the law is written, that is 100% true. However, they are sacred from the time they are made. The Haudenosaunee Grand Council of Chiefs has said as such, and we have an obligation to find ways of returning them. The Haudenosaunee, represented by the Onondaga, argue that Haudenosaunee people live on both sides of the arbitrary geopolitical border established by the United States and Canada, and they don't adhere to those borders in the way that US and Canadian citizens would. So therefore, whether it originated in Canada or not doesn't matter. They belong to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and as keepers of the Central Fire, the Onondaga Nation is responsible for ensuring their return. However, one of the challenges is that if folks on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve disagreed with, if we went through the process, wrote the letter of intent, and repatriated them, Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve has no recourse through the counterclaim process to contest that notice of intent to repatriate, because they are not a federally recognized tribe in the United States. So what do? We work with the Onondaga, we work with the Haudenosaunee Standing Committee on Burial Regulations and Burial Rights, and we have a Zoom meeting. We look at the list of medicine faces and cornhusk faces and the small figurines that are carved of dancers wearing them, which are also sacred, even though they were likely made for sale. And then we go through, we examine that list, and we determine cultural affiliation for the few that do originate in what is today the United States, and identify the ones that originate in Canada. And basically what we did is we asked the Haudenosaunee Standing Committee for a written letter stating that as the standing body that represents Haudenosaunee peoples on both sides of the border, that they support the Onondaga claiming those masks originating in Canada to be repatriated to the Onondaga so that they could then distribute them to the appropriate medicine societies. So once we had that letter, we did our due diligence, we researched, we compared the notes in the object files to the accession records, to the archival information to ensure that we were attributing these belongings to the appropriate tribal nation. After that, we published our notice of intent to repatriate. And then as of July 11th, we will then be able to begin conversations with the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee Standing Committee on what the next steps are. There are no slides or images of the medicine faces or the corn husk faces because they are not to be seen, used, handled, or otherwise interacted with by anybody who isn't a member of those medicine societies. So that means we will also destroy any images that we have of them in the collection or return those images to the Onondaga if they would like that to happen. So we don't know what the packing, crating, and shipping process will look like. That'll be a conversation that we have to have with knowledge keepers and tribal representatives. But that's a little bit of how that process worked. I think what this means is that there are still more medicine faces in the collection, and we are awaiting their repatriation claims from the appropriate nations within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This honors the spirit of the law because we are returning belongings that are not technically within the bounds of NAGPRA. And I can't remember what my third point in my list of 3 was, but we're also doing that too, I assure you. And then we, in addition to that, we are expecting both NAGPRA and non-NAGPRA consultations with the Blackfoot Confederacy in Canada. In fact, many years ago, is Melissa here? She's not here, but Melissa was instrumental in finding another really interesting workaround to repatriate a medicine bundle to the Blackfoot Confederacy in Canada via the Blackfeet tribe of Montana using the Jay Treaty. So this medicine bundle had eagle feathers associated with it, which cannot be transported across international lines, but Indigenous people can transport eagle material across international borders via something called the Jay Treaty. So we repatriated a medicine bundle with eagle feathers to Canada via the Blackfeet Nation of Montana, who carried it across the border using the Jay Treaty. So they're coming back for another consultation. Again, this is ongoing. We'll see what that process looks like. And then the All Apache NAGPRA working group are coming to visit us in the near-ish future to do another repatriation consultation. Many of these groups have been here before. Those visits have resulted in repatriation, but within tribal communities, what constitutes a sacred object or what constitutes an object of cultural patrimony changes over time. So something in 1999 that somebody saw that they decided didn't need to be repatriated, that could change in this next consultation. So it really just depends. Just because somebody comes once and you consult and there's no repatriation resulting from that doesn't mean that you're done corresponding or consulting with that tribal nation. So yeah, happy to answer any questions at the end, and I'll turn it over to Chance.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to say I really appreciate Chris and Steve and their kind of quick overview of NAGPRA and how it came to be and what it does. I think it was pretty good explanation, in my opinion. Also realize that some of you may not know me or know who I am. I'm a Indigenous intern here in the archaeology collections. I started in the fall, and I'm about to be done here with my hours, so coming to an end here. But my name's Chance. I am a recent graduate of the Museum and Field Studies program at CU Boulder, master's degree. I know there's a few of you out there that are also from the MFS program, and Before that, I did cultural resource management and archaeology work down in Durango, Colorado. I went to Fort Lewis College, and I worked with this private CRM company doing a lot of archaeology work and did a few excavations. But if any of you are familiar with CRM work, it's kind of 8 days on, a few days off, 8 days on, a few days off, or usually something like that. But in between, I also started working with the Southern Ute tribe in their cultural preservation office, and I was actually a NAGPRA assistant to their NAGPRA coordinator and tribal historic preservation officers. So I got to deal with a lot of NAGPRA cases, archaeological site visits, kind of some outreach to the public, some presentations to like the San Juan Basin Archaeological Society, I think they're called. And I got to be in a lot of tribal consultations, well, not a lot, but a few. And then when I was at Fort Lewis College, I was on their NAGPRA committee as a student member, so I got to be in consultations on that end of the consultation. So I have a pretty good experience. I've been on the tribal side, I've been on the archaeological side, and now I'm on the museum side of everything. So, I just want to say that I am originally from South Dakota. I'm born and raised on my reservation, Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. So, with that in mind, everything I do, everything I think of, my worldview, perspective, point of view, I'm always going to put my people and the broader indigenous community first in everything I do. So that's what brought me to being involved, or reaching out with Chris and Steve, that I wanted to be involved with DMNS's NAGPRA dealings. So, and that's about all I have. Not to go over time, so I think we can go to questions. So I think we're going to open it to Q&A.
The terrifying cube. All I can move? I'm not throwing it. I'll break it somehow.
Thank you. Is it, that's fine. Thank you all. It's Casey. Never hesitating to ask a question. I think it's great, and I just want to say how much I appreciate being able to, whenever we have tours through conservation, to be able to say that the museum takes a position of giving authority to the communities from which these belongings have come that we have stewardship over. So thank you for that. My question is just about the financial side of it. And I was interested that Atlam and Mellon have come together to create a fund to support tribes and communities to do the work or pay for the things. But could you address how much that, sort of how you've seen the impact of that, either beneficially here or with other tribal communities in actually being able to realize that repatriations? Does that make sense?
Want me?
I could start. So there are a lot of costs associated with both consultations and then the physical repatriation of belongings. So for instance, if folks would like to come consult, there are grants through NAGPRA that can fund consultations. That doesn't, some tribal nations have funds and resources on their own, others don't. We are lucky that we are at a well-resourced institution that can help with those costs, including travel, accommodations, meals, et cetera. And again, there are also NAGPRA grants to help offset the cost of the crating, shipping, and physical movement of the belongings. But it is a huge challenge, and it's not an excuse for institutions that don't have that capacity to not do it. But we live in a world that is run by money, and money is not as easy for all institutions or tribal nations to come by. So it is a huge hindrance for, depending on the situation, but it's not cheap. To 83 belongings will go back to New York. That requires a lot of work to ensure that they are safely stored while they're being moved. The materials, the physical shipping of them, whether that's a dedicated art shipper or some other way of getting them there. So it's a huge challenge.
If I remember, I think NAGPRA grants for consultation are up to 25,000, and a repatriation grant is 5,000, I believe.
And that's just for the tribal communities, or is that for the whole, that the museum to do their? I don't want to dwell on this.
I think both can apply.
It's both.
My question is, in light of the experience of the Museum of Art, and also in consideration of the revamping of History Colorado's experience with Sand Creek, can you maybe share a little bit of your ideas of what Crane Hall or the collection is going to look like over the next few years?
I think it's a little premature to talk about Crane Hall and what it might look like. I will say that all NAGPRA or repatriation consultations include what is in collections, but also what was on view in Crane Hall. How that bears out on what happens on the second floor over the coming years, I think is still to be determined.
Have the tribes started to get involved? I imagine they're showing interest.
In the deinstallation?
No, in the redesign.
No, we are focused on an ethical and collaborative deinstall before we even begin talking about the redesign. I mean, there's over 1,000 belongings on view. There's significant infrastructural and conservation and collections issues that need to be addressed. So our plan is to work with tribal reps as we begin to plan how best to not only deinstall their belongings, but how to care for them while they remain here, and then to, again, re-engage conversations about repatriation during that process.
Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to talk about all of this. Since I'm someone who, even for my job, has had to talk to at least Steve here about some of the repatriation things that we've done, and I've had to have training discussing this in the community, I'm curious as far as, I know we do keep, not to ever pat ourselves on the backs or anything, but we do at least have spaces where we can publicly disclose the things that we've repatriated and whatnot. I was curious, or at least I've talked to at least Steve in the past about how some of this information may be a little bit more widespread in the future. Are there any plans to maybe talk more publicly at large in some of our repatriation efforts, or is this something that we're more or less just trying to keep institutional?
If I can, I think that it's a delicate balance between really hard work, some of the hardest work that people can do, talking about ancestors, talking about their most sacred objects, their communal objects, which brings up past traumas and ongoing traumas. And so we oftentimes will have discussions, we have consultations, we have visits going on all the time, and we'll talk to people and ask them what they would like. And if they would like us to not say anything and just keep it between us, we will honor that. If they're okay with us doing something a little bit more publicly accessible, we're okay with that. But we haven't really done a lot of press releases and things like that because the work is so difficult and so challenging and so fraught. That being said, we have published a lot of this in the scholarly literature in various places. We're going to continue doing that, hopefully with co-authors, collaborators from the tribal nations and so on. But I can give you lists of things, places where we've published what the museum has done in this regard. And it's kind of a case-by-case basis, and sensitivities do change as we go through. So we want to be extra cautious about how we're approaching this, and we just got to be sensitive to that. So short answer, probably not. We're not going to go out and say too much, and yet if the spirit is right and we can do that, then we're perfectly willing to share as appropriate. Chance, do you want to add anything about what tribal expectations are in this regard?
I will say that it's probably a really fine line between patting yourself on the back, and I know institutions want to kind of show that they're doing this great work and getting things repatriated how it should be, but I think because of the nature of what is being repatriated, that at least the tribes that I worked with, they don't want to see it as public knowledge or really make a big deal of it because it has to do with human ancestors that were taken wrongfully.
Good talk.
It's Rick. You can throw it.
Chance to kind of expand on it a little bit. How do you feel that indigenous groups view how the whole process, not only with this museum, but nationwide, is being handled? Does it tend to be a fairly positive, that people are doing what they can? Or I'm sure there's a lot of issues and problems, but just what's kind of the general thought of how the whole process is going?
From, I guess, what I've read and listened to and heard, NAGPRA, the law is a great thing, but just as, Steve explained, it's written by lawyers who don't know anything about, cultural knowledge or tradition, ceremonies, language. So there's definitely some drawbacks or limitations to what it can do. Again, like Steve was saying, it doesn't require a return or anything, but there are some new proposed changes, I guess, to NAGPRA that are trying to address some of these things that they probably didn't think of in 1990 when they were signing the law. I'm trying to think of an example. Cultural affiliation, the 10 lines of evidence, like as Steve was saying, it's usually the museum that determines those things. But now tribes can use geographical evidence. So if you have some documents or something that says there was a tribe in this area during this year, you can affiliate it that way. That way museums aren't dragging their feet in returning. And examples of that would be, treaties that says these tribes were in this area at this time, or executive orders, or, excavation field notes, or things like that.
And if I could just add, one of the things with cultural affiliation, again, many institutions use that determination to hide behind what we would argue is doing the right thing. So a tribal nation would make a claim based on what NAGPRA says, and then the institution could go to them and say, well, you're Hopi. I don't believe that you're related to ancestral Mogollon, in New Mexico where I do archaeological research. They could just say, nope, I don't. The preponderance of the evidence is such that we can't agree with that cultural determination. And for me, one of the things at the end of the day was recognizing that the ancestors that we're talking about are almost exclusively Native American in museums, right? And some museums will say, nope, we've got non-Native American human remains, which is true. But they're not often 99% Euro-American human remains in these institutions. So what we wanted to do, one of the things that we wanted to do is not hide behind the cultural affiliation thing, because we knew that they were Native American. We could start there. That's the cultural affiliation. They're not Irish American. They're ancestral to Native Americans. So rather than force the issue into a one-to-one, and a federal agency, in fact, published a one-to-one concordance between modern tribal nations and archaeological cultures, which were defined by the archaeologists without consulting with the tribal nations. I mean, it was literally a one-to-one concordance, and that borders on the absurd. So really, I haven't talked to any tribal nations that come in and say, all right, you're right, we're not affiliated with them, you can just leave them in the museum. The interests are to get these ancestors back in the ground. And so cultural affiliation is just an arbitrary cultural construct on the legal side of things, rather than truly addressing the cultural issues that are at play. The other thing that I wanted to say is that a lot of people have argued that science is under threat by NAGPRA. And my response to that is that archaeologists, my folks, were doing archaeology without talking to Native Americans for 150 years. That is not good science. Right? If you want to know about folks that were living in a certain place, you might want to talk to their direct descendants. So science, I would argue, has gotten better because of NAGPRA. Yes, there's litigation. Yes, there's legal issues. Yes, there's all of that kind of stuff. And how dare we say that we're doing a complete archaeology without talking to the people that we know are their descendants? So that's one of the reasons why we've been working so closely with the Zuni and the Acoma in New Mexico on the archaeology that we are doing down there, is because it's their ancestors. It's their direct predecessors.
Hey everyone. First, thank you so much. This was just so great to get a chance to sit down and really hear what this is, what we've been doing, where we're going. I had what I hope are two very quick questions. The first one was, when it comes to the actual NAGPRA procedure, is there anything on the museum side to encourage actually publishing these registers? Or is there anything on the museum side to encourage making preliminary determinations of tribal groups to contact? Or is it just they'll publish the register when they feel like it, they'll make a determination if and when a tribe decides to file a claim or make contact? Like, is it just nothing from pushing the museum side forward?
Yes and no. So the changes that Chance was describing to NAGPRA, which will probably take at least a year to go into effect, will place more burden on cultural institutions to be proactive about this. But it is, as it currently stands, a lot of this rests with the tribal nations, the tribal historic preservation officers who represent those nations. So for instance, we have our inventories published, they're available. Until somebody decides to schedule a consultation or submit a claim, we are under no obligation to proactively research the collection, contact the appropriate tribal rep and say, hey, we know this is here and we know that this doesn't belong here. What would you like to do? But once a claim is submitted, you have, I believe, 60 days to respond. So once a claim is submitted, the clock starts ticking. And that means publishing the notice of intent to repatriate within that window. Once that is published in the Federal Register, there's a back and forth process with National NAGPRA. They have basically a template that you fill out because they all need to be formatted the exact same way, same font, same headings, it's a template that you just sort of plug the information in. And getting that information takes research. But once you go back and forth and they approve it, it gets published. Then there's a 30-day counterclaim window. And that basically means, okay, we published this notice that we intend to repatriate 83 cultural belongings that are both sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. So sacred objects being that they're important to ongoing religious ceremonial activities, objects of cultural patrimony, meaning they're not owned by an individual, they're owned by a clan, a society, a group. If somebody, if Tonawanda Seneca rep says, hey, we don't agree with this, they have 30 days to let us know that they're submitting a counterclaim, and then we go through that sort of separate adjudication process. So that's kind of the timeline once a formal claim is submitted, but we're under no obligation as the law currently exists to do anything other than publicly announce what we have in the collection currently.
And yet, that being said, we as an institution decided 16 years ago to proactively address these issues. So there's only one other museum that I know of, really, and that's CU Boulder Natural History Museum, which was as proactive in terms of repatriating human remains. The court of public opinion shifted with the presidential election of 2016, and then again with the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And the seismic shifts in institutional proactivity with regard to repatriation are mind-blowing to somebody who's been involved in this work for 3 decades. It is astonishing how many more institutions are taking proactive steps to do this. In theory, an institution could have lost its federal funding by not being in compliance with NAGPRA, but that hasn't happened. It's a toothless threat, basically. But times they are a-changing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
Hi, not to get maybe too touchy-feely, but I was wondering if you could also touch on a little bit of maybe the personal motivations or the feelings behind doing some of this work.
For me?
All of you.
All of
yeah.
us? Okay. For me, it was when I just realized, it's that 99.9% number. Museums are full of Native American ancestors and nobody else. And we have a word for that, and it's called discrimination. And so my argument is that we should curate everybody or we should curate nobody. That was my impetus. So, yeah.
Can you repeat the question? Just kidding. I will say that I had zero knowledge of archaeology or NAGPRA until I got to undergrad at Fort Lewis, and then I took a class on a museum class, and and then reading these articles and books, and I had this realization that archaeologists were always white, and museums had human remains of these excavations and hundreds of thousands of human remains across the nation. And I think it hit me that we needed more, representation in archaeology and museums in general, and that kind of steered me towards changing my major to anthropology, and diving into the archaeological side, because I thought, well, if I'm out there in the field or doing excavation, I'll be the first person to maybe come across this and I could say something. But after doing that for 4 years, I had another realization that it wasn't enough for me. I wanted to make more of a difference. And everybody that I spoke with about it, they all said, well, you should get a master's degree, and that'll help you open up a few more doors. So that's what I did. I went to grad school at CU Boulder and majored in museum studies program, and I'm pretty much in the doors that I wanted to be in. I wanted to be in consultations. I wanted to be a NAGPRA coordinator or a tribal historic preservation officer someday. And I wanted to be at the spearhead of these issues and have a say in everything that we do and kind of amplify and help bring up my fellow Native people in these discussions.
I got to know, what was your major before you switched? It's okay. You can say it. We've all been there.
Well, I did liberal arts because I wanted to transfer. Then I thought, well, I didn't want to do Native studies. I didn't want to study myself. So I went with anthropology.
I think for me, the motivation, and I guess like my sort of professional trajectory has always been motivated by a desire or an aspiration to enact change that's hopefully meaningful, but at least hopefully modest as well. And I think it's actually the most rewarding part of being a museum professional and a curator. I mean, there's lots of fun things that you get to do, but the relationship building and the trust building that has to happen to see through a successful repatriation claim, starting with the initial emails and consultations, is really humbling and really challenging. And I guess that's what makes it really rewarding. I mean, think about a tribal, you're one person at a museum, but tribal historic preservation officers are dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of museums across the country and then internationally sometimes as well. So to do this particular aspect of the work, I think it's the moment where you, as somebody whose career has historically been predicated on individual achievements, to put that aside and be truly of service to people is it's a gift and an opportunity, and the motivation has I think always been to move the needle, however slightly, in the direction of like doing the right thing.
I think to respect people's time, we'll thank our speakers. If you have other questions, I think they'd be welcome to answer them if you want to just approach the stage. But thank you very much. And look for another pop-up lecture at the end of July.